Hi again, Professor Monroe from the Applied Ethics Department here. And in this video, we'll talk about professional codes of ethics. We'll talk about what a profession is, how professional codes of ethics differ from corporate and government codes of ethics. We'll cover characteristics of effective professional codes, and then we'll talk about some of the limitations of professional codes of ethics. First, what is a profession? Well, it should be noted that there's some debate about what counts as a profession and what doesn't. We're going to leave that aside because that's a subject for a more philosophical debate than this. But roughly speaking, a profession is an occupation or vocation requiring training in a specialized field. The specialization is important here. It's what separates a profession from a regular mundane job like filling popcorn in a movie theater. There's a kind of specialized knowledge that members of a profession have that isn't shared by the general public. As a result, professionals are typically given more autonomy than non-professionals, and they have a little bit more leeway than regular employees. As a result, professionals tend to be held to higher standards than non-professionals because we hold them with a certain level of public trust. Because they have that specialized knowledge, they know more than us, and we have to trust that they're going to use their education and their specialization wisely. There are a couple different ways that professional codes of ethics differ from other types of codes. First, professional codes of ethics are written, monitored, and enforced on a peer level. That is to say, the members of the profession themselves collaborate and work together to write the code of ethics, and it's meant to be binding on all the members of that particular profession. But there's a kind of democratic way of going about coming up with those codes, and the members of the professions tend to police their own. After all, since they're the ones who know best the nature of their field, it stands to reason that they'd be the ones to hold each other accountable, as the outsiders might not have the specialized knowledge necessary to do that. Another difference that you'll see in professional codes of ethics is that they tend to exhibit more variety because the goals and aims of professions differ more widely than businesses. Businesses are all about making money at the end of the day, but professions might have different ambitions, goals, and issues that they face. For example, the ethical issues faced by a doctor will be very different in many cases than the ethical issues faced by a police officer, which will be very different from the ethical issues faced by a teacher. As a result, the focuses of the codes of ethics will differ, and they'll be context specific. So you see more variety in the kinds of principles and the ideals that you'll see in a professional code than you would say in a business code or a government code, where the issues tend to be basically the same regardless of the area that you work in. Additionally, some codes of ethics for professionals might be serious standards, like the American Medical Association's Code of Ethics or Bar Association codes. Others may just be ceremonial. So for example, if there's a code of ethics for stringed instrument makers, that seems to be more of a ceremonial kind of code rather than one that has any real teeth or is serious and binding. There are certain characteristics that effective professional codes live up to. Good professional codes, the serious ones, are meant to be regulative of people's behavior, so they've got to meet a couple benchmarks in order to be taken seriously. First, an effective professional codes of ethics covers the important ethical issues in a field thoroughly and adequately. Since professions know that they're going to be faced with ethical issues, their code of ethics should reflect the typical issues that they'd face and offer guidance for the professional on how to navigate those problems. Second, an effective professional code of ethics protects the interests of the public and those served by the profession. As I mentioned earlier, professionals have specialized knowledge, and we're sort of ignorant of what the professional is knowledgeable in, so we have to be able to rely on their trustworthiness, that we're in good hands when we take part in the services of a professional. There's a kind of public trust that goes with that. Third, members of a profession must be familiar with the code and its contents. That is to say, people who are in that field have to know the code of ethics and understand what it demands of them. If they're ignorant of the code, then the code of ethics does no good. Fourth, a professional code of ethics should be specific and honest and more than just ceremonial. So it has to address the issues and be frank about them and offer really genuine guidance to the people under its authority rather than just being a collection of noble ideals. Fifth, a professional code of ethics to be effective must be enforceable and actually enforced. So there has to be some way of policing that people are following the code of ethics and consequences if they don't. This is a fairly common thing with some organizations. For example, bar associations for law are pretty typically good about enforcing their codes of ethics. and regulating the behavior of the members of its body. Sixth, an effective professional code of ethics has to be periodically revised and open to change. As the nature of issues change and the nature of a profession changes over time, the code of ethics should shift to reflect that so it doesn't become outdated and stale. And lastly, the code of ethics must actually regulate the conduct of professionals. So it has to be something that's effective in getting professionals to behave according to certain standards. Professional codes of ethics do have some limitations. First, some professions can't enforce their code because membership and licensing of the members of that group is not required. Some groups are very good about this. They have agencies or groups within their profession that police and maintain the behavior of their members of their body. Others, not so much, because they aren't required to join any professional associations or things like that. And if that's the case, then it seems difficult to regulate and actually enforce a code. A second limitation is that sometimes codes of ethics are too aspirational. They're just a collection of noble ideals that seem like they're basically unattainable by anyone in the profession. They sound really impressive from a moral perspective, but don't offer any real practical guidance for professionals about everyday problems. Thirdly, sometimes professional codes of ethics will conflict with more general moral principles. And when that's the case, the code of ethics itself doesn't really offer any guidance for how to solve that particular quandary. For example, we can imagine, as many of you maybe have, a lawyer whose obligation to tell the truth conflicts with his fiduciary obligation to represent the interests of a client. The general moral principle that tells us we ought to be honest seems to be superseded in some way by this professional code of ethics, but there's some discussion about the extent to which that's legitimate. Why is it, or how is it, that a professional code of ethics trumps general moral principles? And should that be the case? Well, that's a question that the professional's code can't answer. So it doesn't really help professionals resolve conflicts with bigger moral concerns. Lastly, professional codes of ethics offer little guidance for how to handle the behavior of a profession as a whole. They're very good about regulating the behavior of individual members of a profession, let's say, or some are. So the Bar Association might regulate the conduct of an individual lawyer. But what do we do, or how does it help, the code of ethics help, when it's the profession as a whole that seems to be doing something morally questionable? If the insiders themselves are writing the rules, to what higher standard must they be held? So within the code of ethics itself, there's little guidance on how to look at the profession as a whole. That concludes our discussion of professional codes of ethics. In the next video, we'll discuss corporate codes and talk about their strengths and weaknesses.